All right, so you ready to dive into virtue ethics?
Mm-hmm.
It's been around forever, right?
Mm.
But it's still got so much to say about, like, how we should live, what it means to be good. Especially, I think, for, like, philosophers.
Oh, yeah, definitely. For philosophers, virtue ethics just, it clicks. You know what I mean? It's like,
Yeah.
forget the rules, forget just like the outcomes. Let's talk about who we are as people.
Yeah, exactly. It's like being a good person isn't just checking off boxes. It's about, it's deeper. It's about your character, how you see things, how that, like, shapes all your choices.
Right, right. It's like becoming a better person, always growing, always working towards, that ideal of virtue.
Okay, so we're talking to a philosopher here.
Yeah.
Someone who, gets all this. So let's skip the basics, huh? Let's get into the good stuff.
Yeah. Well, for me, one of the most interesting things about virtue ethics is this whole idea of eudaimonia.
Oh, yeah. Eudaimonia, like
Mhm.
flourishing, right? Living a good life. Isn't that straight from Aristotle?
Exactly. Aristotle was all about how, like, being virtuous isn't just, morally right. It's like the key to happiness,
Hmm.
to really living well.
Makes sense, right?
Yeah.
But, like, there's this whole debate, even within virtue ethics. Like, is being virtuous, is that enough to flourish?
Yeah. It's a good question.
So on one side, you've got folks who are like, being virtuous, that's it. That's eudaimonia right there. Like, if you're brave, if you're fair, if you're wise, doesn't that just make for a good life?
Yeah, yeah. But then you have the other side saying, well, hold on. Virtue's important, sure, but it might not be the whole picture. What about bad luck? What about things you can't control?
Right, like you could be the most virtuous person ever, but if you're, like, constantly sick or totally alone, can you really say you're flourishing?
Exactly. And philosophers like Philippa Foot, they argued that you need some good luck too. Like good health, good relationships. Those things matter for eudaimonia too.
So it's like, even in ethics, we can't escape the whole, fate versus free will thing.
Right. And that whole question, like how much control do we really have over our happiness? That's something virtue ethicists are still thinking about.
Now, something I've always found kind of tricky, is this difference between, like, being continent and being truly virtuous.
Oh, yeah, that's classic Aristotle. It trips people up all the time.
Right. Like, on one hand, you've got someone who does the right thing, but they're, struggling. They're fighting their desires. That's continence, right?
Exactly. They're like gritting their teeth, doing good, but not really enjoying it.
And then you've got the truly virtuous person. They do the right thing effortlessly. It's just, like, who they are.
Right. For Aristotle, it's not just about doing good, it's about wanting to do good. Your desires and your reason, they're like totally aligned. You act from a place of, genuine goodness.
So it's not just about, like, changing your behavior. It's about, like, a much deeper change.
Yeah.
Aligning, like, your thoughts, your feelings, your actions.
Exactly. It's like becoming the kind of person who, like, enjoys being good. You find joy in living a virtuous life.
Okay, but I'm sure some folks are listening and they're thinking, all right, this is all very inspiring, but, like, what about when things get really tough? What about real ethical dilemmas where, like, virtues clash? How does virtue ethics help us there?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
Yeah.
And it leads us to one of the most important ideas in virtue ethics, phronesis.
Phronesis, isn't that, like, practical wisdom?
Exactly. It's the ability to look at a situation and, like, really understand it, weigh different values, and make a judgment about, what's the virtuous thing to do.
It's not just about blindly following rules then.
No, not at all. Phronesis is about understanding the virtues so well that you can apply them intelligently. Like different situations call for different responses.
So it's kind of like an art.
Yeah.
You get better at it with experience, with practice.
You could say that. It's about developing this, like, moral perception, this ability to see what really matters in each situation, and then, respond virtuously.
Okay, so let's say you're in a situation where, I don't know, honesty clashes with kindness. How does phronesis help?
Well, first, you got to understand both virtues, right? What does it really mean to be honest? What does it really mean to be kind? And then how do those virtues, relate to this specific situation?
Right, so it's not just about, like, picking one virtue over the other. It's about understanding them both, deeply.
Exactly. Phronesis requires you to think things through, but also to be sensitive. You need empathy. You got to understand how people are affected by your actions.
So it's not just cold, hard logic then.
Nope. It's about bringing your whole self to the table. Your intellect, your emotions, your experiences. That's how you make a truly wise and virtuous choice.
Okay, so phronesis sounds really important. Like, it helps us when things are complicated, right?
Yeah.
But doesn't that make it kind of subjective? Like, what if I think I'm being wise, but I'm just, like, fooling myself?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's a huge question in virtue ethics. Like, how do we make sure our judgments are good? How do we balance, like, personal judgment with some kind of objective standard?
Right, because if it's all just, like, up to me, then isn't that just relativism? Like,
Yep.
everyone gets to decide what's virtuous, and there's no way to say, if someone's wrong.
That's a big worry for sure. And virtue ethicists have been thinking about that for a long time. One way to address it is to look at, like, community and tradition.
Oh, interesting. So it's not just me by myself figuring it all out.
Right. Thinkers like Alistair McIntyre, they say virtues aren't just these individual things. They come from, like, our social practices, our traditions, the shared values of a community.
So it's kind of like we learn how to be virtuous from the people around us,
Yeah.
from watching how they live.
Yeah, kind of like an apprenticeship, right? You learn by seeing how the masters do it, by being part of a community that values virtue.
But what about this, though? Communities can be wrong, right? Traditions can be messed up. And even, like, the best role models, they're still human. They make mistakes. So how do we avoid just, like, copying the bad stuff?
That's where critical thinking comes in. Virtue ethics isn't about just, like, blindly following. It's about thinking for yourself, questioning your assumptions, being willing to change your mind when you learn something new.
So it's this back and forth, then,
Yeah,
between, like, what we inherit from tradition and what we figure out for ourselves.
exactly. We have to respect the wisdom of the past, but also be open to, like, new ideas, new challenges. That's how we grow, both individually and as a community.
Makes sense. But I'm still thinking about this. Even if we all agree on, like, what the virtues are, can't they still be used for bad things? I mean, you see it all the time, right? People are doing horrible stuff, but they think they're being brave or loyal or whatever.
Oh, for sure. That's why it's so important to think about the context, the social and political stuff. Like, it's not enough to just be individually virtuous. We got to make sure our actions aren't hurting others, especially those who are already vulnerable.
So it's like individual virtue is important, but you can't ignore the big picture. How your actions affect other people, how they affect society.
Absolutely. And this is where, like, virtue ethics can connect with other ideas like social justice. We got to make sure our pursuit of virtue doesn't just reinforce, like, existing inequalities.
Yeah, because I can totally see how someone could be, like, super courageous, but they're fighting for a cause that's actually really harmful.
Exactly. That's why virtues like critical thinking and humility are so crucial. We got to be willing to listen to others, especially those who are different from us. We have to be willing to learn from their experiences.
Now, earlier you said that virtue ethics is like a growing field. So I'm curious, where do you see it going? What are some of the exciting new things happening in virtue ethics?
Well, one thing that's really cool is how people are applying virtue ethics to, like, specific areas like environmental ethics, business ethics, even the ethics of AI.
Oh, wow, that's interesting. So instead of just focusing on rules, you're asking, like, what would a virtuous person do in this situation?
Exactly. Like, what would a virtuous environmentalist look like? What about a virtuous business leader, a virtuous AI developer? What kind of character would they need to navigate those tricky ethical questions?
That's awesome. It's like taking those old ideas about virtue and making them relevant to, like, today's problems.
Right. And another trend I'm seeing is this connection between virtue ethics and psychology.
Oh, really? What's that about?
Well, some people are trying to, like, ground virtue ethics in what we know about how people actually think and behave. How do we really develop virtues? What role do emotions play?
Makes sense. It's one thing to say be virtuous. It's another to, like, actually understand how to get there.
Exactly. And some psychologists are realizing that virtue ethics can actually help them understand, like, what it means to be mentally healthy. Instead of just focusing on what's wrong with people, we can look at what it means to flourish, to have a good character.
So it's like both fields are learning from each other.
Yeah, it's a two-way street. And it's leading to some really cool research, like, about how habits and practices can shape our character. Even small things we do every day can make a difference.
That's hopeful, right? Like, we're not just stuck with whatever character we're born with. We can actually change, become better.
Right. And that's super empowering, right? We have the power to choose who we want to be.
I love that. But, we got to be honest. There are a lot of people out there who, like, aren't sold on virtue ethics. They say it's too vague, too subjective, too focused on individuals, and not enough on, like, social justice.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And those are valid criticisms, for sure. Virtue ethics, like any theory, it's got its weaknesses, things we need to keep thinking about and working on.
So it's not like a perfect system. There's still room for debate, for improvement.
For sure. And that's what makes it so interesting. It's a living tradition, you know? People are always reinterpreting it, finding new ways to apply it.
That's what I love about philosophy, you know?
Yeah.
It's not about just memorizing answers. It's about asking questions, thinking critically, and always being open to learning more.
Exactly. And that's what virtue ethics is all about, too. It's a way of life, you know? A journey of becoming more thoughtful, more compassionate, more wise.
I think what really gets me about virtue ethics, is that it's not like, here's the rule, follow it. It's more like, hey, life's messy, right? There's not always a right answer. You got to figure things out, use your judgment.
Yeah, it's definitely not a paint by numbers kind of ethics.
Right. It's about growing, learning, being like more sensitive to what each situation calls for.
And it's about who you are deep down. You know, what you care about, the kind of person you're trying to be. It all matters.
It's like, that saying, character is what you do when no one's watching.
Yeah.
Virtue ethics is like, nah, character is what you do even when everyone's watching, because it's just like who you are.
Totally. It's about like this deep change inside you. Your values, your actions, it all lines up.
Okay, but let's be real. Someone's listening right now, and they're like, all right, I want to be more virtuous, but how? Where do I even start?
Well, one thing you can do is like think about people you admire, you know, people who really embody the virtues you value. Could be anyone, real or fictional, historical, whatever.
Oh, like find your role models, your like moral heroes.
Exactly. Read about them, study their lives, think about like what made them so virtuous, how did they handle tough situations?
And then, really dig into what each virtue means. Like, what does it really mean to be honest, to be courageous, to be compassionate?
Right, because we throw those words around, but do we really understand them?
And then once you have a better grasp on the virtues, start looking for ways to like practice them, in your daily life.
Yeah, even small things like being more patient when you're driving, being more generous with your time, just like little chances to flex those virtue muscles.
So it's like a moral workout.
Totally. And like any workout, consistency is key. The more you practice, the stronger you get.
Now, something I've always found cool about virtue ethics is how the virtues all like connect. It's not just about being good at one thing. It's about like the whole package.
Yeah, it's not just a bunch of separate traits. It's about developing a well-rounded character, like all the virtues working together, supporting each other.
It's like a symphony orchestra.
Yeah.
You need all the instruments playing in harmony to make beautiful music.
I love that. And that's important because it keeps us from going overboard with one virtue and neglecting the others.
Right. Like you could be so focused on being honest that you end up being like rude and hurtful, or so brave that you become reckless.
Exactly. That's where phronesis comes in again, right? That practical wisdom helps you find the right balance.
It's like a dance then, constantly adjusting, finding that harmony between all the different virtues.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And that's what makes virtue ethics so challenging, but also so rewarding. It's not a set of rules, it's a way of life. Always growing, always learning, always trying to be better.
I think that's a great takeaway for everyone listening. This isn't about finding the perfect answer or becoming a saint overnight. It's a journey.
And it's a journey best taken with others, you know? Find people who inspire you, have those tough conversations, and keep that fire for goodness burning.
Well, this has been an amazing deep dive into virtue ethics. Hopefully it's given you all some new things to think about, some new ways to see yourselves and the world. So keep pondering, keep practicing, and keep striving to be the best versions of yourselves. That's what virtue ethics is all about.